All right, so we're going to talk about the foot and how the foot actually develops, okay, and how foot deformities or structural deformities develop. So first, in utero, all right, we start off. We basically have a calcaneal varus and we have a forefoot varus. So basically, when we sit in, our foot's a very varus foot, meaning that the calcaneus is inverted. All right, the talus is externally rotated. If this is my left foot, it's externally rotated or abducted. Our forefoot is inverted. Okay, and then as we develop, as we start crawling, as we start walking, we start off varus and we put that foot on the ground, and gravity and the mass of our bodies will actually take it and it'll bring it to the ground. So the calcaneus will start off varus and it'll actually go to the ground and get the medial plantar condyle on the ground, which will make it neutral. All right. If it doesn't fully, it's called autogenic derotation. If it doesn't fully autogenic derotate, meaning that it doesn't get all the way to the ground, then we'll end up with a calcaneal varus or a subtalar varus. So that's one of the structural foot deformities. It's a calcaneal or subtalar varus. In the podiatric literature, they call it a subtalar varus. Okay, so that would be how a rear foot varus commonly would be acquired. Okay, now in the forefoot, what can happen is the calcaneus can get to the ground. Now the frontal plane motion of the calcaneus is actually it's converted to transverse plane motion of the talus. That's the torque converter of the subtalar joint. So if the calcaneus can get to the ground, if it gets to the ground, the talus should adduct or internally rotate. It should internally rotate and get back to neutral. If it got back to neutral, that means the forefoot would be on the ground, the big ball of the foot, and it would be in the same plane, in the frontal plane, as the rear foot. That would be a normal foot. Well, if that talus fails to come around, if it fails to fully derotate, we'll end up with a forefoot varus. So our rear foot might be, our calcaneus might be neutral, but our forefoot actually is splayed off the ground like this. Okay? Well, if our forefoot is splayed off the ground, one thing the body always wants to do is keep the balls of the feet level and your eyeballs level. All right, always wants to keep your balls level. All right, so it's not. This would be really unstable if our medial part of our foot was off the ground, because you know our foot is shaped like this. It's a big boat-looking thing. So it goes from our heel all the way and spreads out to our toes, and we want to get the balls of our feet on the ground. That's when we have the most stability. So how would I get that forefoot to the ground? The only way to do it would be to pronate or compensate or pronate compensate by pronating through the subtalar joint. So if I looked at you from the back, I would see an everted calcaneus. It would already be everted, and the lower leg would already be internally rotated. But the reason why it's doing that is it's trying to get the balls of the feet to the ground, okay, due to the forefoot varus. Okay. If it didn't compensate for that, we would bear a lot of weight on that fifth metatarsal, and that's where we could get a fracture there, or what's called a Jones fracture, okay, on the fifth metatarsal. Okay, so that's a forefoot varus, rear foot varus. Now, if that talus keeps going, if it falls further and further and further, we could end up with a true forefoot valgus. Okay, now some people, with a forefoot valgus, you'll get what's called a flexible forefoot valgus or a rigid forefoot valgus, and a lot of people think a forefoot valgus could be a compensation due to a rear foot varus. So if I have a rear foot varus and it's not compensated, meaning I don't pronate through the subtalar joint to get the medial part of the calcaneus to the ground, well, my body might compensate through the forefoot. So I might drop the first ray down to the ground to get the balls of my feet on the ground. So if I looked at you from behind, I'm going to see an inverted calcaneus if you're on the ground. And if I had you off weight bearing, I would see that if I had the plane of your rear foot, if it was on that plane, your forefoot would be everted relative to that plane. That would be a forefoot valgus. Okay, so if I put that on the ground, I would see a really high arch. The calcaneus would be inverted, and the forefoot would be everted relative to the rear foot. We always describe forefoot relative to the rear foot. Okay, so that's a forefoot valgus. Okay, it could be a plantar flex first ray as well, or a forefoot valgus, or those kind of go hand in hand a little bit. But an equinus condition of the forefoot plantar flexion is really kind of unknown. We don't know really how that develops. It's just a structural type that goes with it. So combination types of foot types would be like a forefoot valgus. Typically will sometimes have a little bit of an equinus in the forefoot. A rear foot varus that's really uncompensated would go with a forefoot valgus. So that would be a real rigid foot that wouldn't evert or pronate or load in the first TZ very well. But your most common foot types are those compensated varices, either forefoot or rear foot. And that would be accentuated by the overpronation to compensate for the varus deformity. And that's when you see a really flat foot. You see a foot that a lot of people would think, oh, it probably does a good job of loading, everting, and pronating. But if it's already in a pronated position, it doesn't have any more pronation available. So it actually doesn't load very well. All right? And then sometimes it'll have a tough time getting out of that everted position to lock up, to push off of. And sometimes it might whip out of there really quickly and actually get unstable on the outside of the foot. So it'd be like an inversion ankle sprain or something like that. So those are some how foot types develop. There's not a lot of research on how it actually, if it's in utero condition, if we're born with it, it's genetic. I think a lot of times it has to do with the shoes we put on at a young age. So as we start walking, our parents want to put us in, nice shoes and things like that. And when we start playing sports, we get the nice high basketball shoe, high top basketball shoe. And if we don't pay attention to actually how the foot is designed to load into the ground, we actually start restricting motion as we're developing. I mean, we know the skeleton doesn't fully ossify until 16 to 18 years of age. The pelvic bones don't. So all through development, all from the time we're 1 and we start walking, all the way up until we're basically out of high school, our bones are forming, our joints are forming, our ligaments, our capsules, everything are forming. So if we start off locking the foot into a shoe, putting ankle braces on it and all kinds of stuff, and then first of all we're not moving as much as we did, then we're going to have problems. And so a lot of these prevalence of structural foot deformities could be developed. As an acquired condition because of the shoe wear, the lack of motion, the lack of multi-directional movement, the lack of stress through the foot and making the forefoot load in many different ways, making the foot adapt to the ground, because the foot's designed to adapt to the ground and then be stable to propel off of. Well, if we put it in a shoe, it's adapting to the shoe. It doesn't really have a chance to adapt to the ground. So if you look at like Kenyan runners and South American runners, South African runners that develop not wearing a lot of shoes, they start training not wearing shoes, they have a prevalence of this barefoot running, there's very low incidence of structural foot deformities. So there's got to be a cause and effect there. So that's a little bit about structural foot deformities, how the foot actually develops. But again, if you're going to understand one thing, this is going to be the key. Next thing we'll probably go into a little bit how to reestablish the proper mobility in that foot. Okay?